been a very exciting thing, and we also have Jay Fields to thank for that. I would like to announce that if you did not get a copy of the final in your section on Thursday, I have some copies. Okay. Ilka, do you have copies?
Yes, I already have some. I have some.
Okay. I do have some copies, so you can pick up the final exam. For my sections, I have your Rwanda responses for you after the lecture is over. And it's, I did want to make sure that I said hello to all of the people out there in the world who are watching us. I know there are lots of people, including some on the Eastern Seaboard. So we want to thank them for joining in, and I want to present to you someone who many of you know, and who is an important part of our helping to make what happens here happen. One of our strongest supporters, and that's Dean Leader. Some of you know me as the Dean, others know me for teaching sociology, but most of you don't know me as the child of a refugee. And so today I get to speak about the thing that touches my heart probably the deepest. And it is from whence I come, and it is why I teach, and it is why I do what I do. I already have tears in my eyes as I begin to tell you the story. But the way we're going to do this is I'm an academic, so I'm going to frame this in the literature on children of survivors so that you'll have some academic material with which to work and to talk about what you're going to learn from the three of us. And I'll make that brief, and then I'll tell my story because I think mine is probably the least dramatic of the three of us, and then we're going to build with intensity. And we have before us Blair Pleasant, who will be speaking second about her experience as a survivor's daughter, and Julia Silverberg, who has quite a story to tell. And then I also know that there are children of survivors in the audience, and so whenever we do this, this is our third year now, we usually have dialogue as well, because just as there is a lot of diversity in the way that people survived the Holocaust, so too there's a lot of diversity about the children of survivors. So let me start out by saying that there is a vast literature on children of survivors, and it's a growing field because, as all of you have heard, the survivors are dying off, and we, the children of, we have to carry the flame. And in fact, the first book written on survivors' children was called The Memorial Candle, because many of us see ourselves as the memorial candle. I was born immediately after, in 1944. My father escaped in 1939, and so I have the legacy of trying to remember my family, and I will tell my story in a few minutes. So the first book was Children of the Holocaust by Helen Epstein, and it's really still a fine read. I would really recommend it. And there is a wonderful project out of University of Pennsylvania called the Transcending Trauma Project. And what they have come up with is that it is not inevitable that people like myself or my father or the parents of these folks and survivors, it is not inevitable that we have post-traumatic stress disorder. No, we are not all depressed and crazy. And I think you can tell that, but often there's a myth. Oh my God, you experienced the Holocaust, genocide, how can you get on with your life? And as you saw with the folks from Rwanda and the Armenian folks, you live. And in fact, you might live fuller and better because your parents survived. But there really is a hierarchy of suffering around the Holocaust. And the hierarchy, and I certainly never identified as a survivor's daughter. And to this day, I always say I'm a refugee's daughter, not a survivor's daughter, because the hierarchy of suffering usually is that the people who are in the concentration camps, the people whose movies you saw the films of, the people in the stripes, the people who went through the biggest traumas, of course we think were the people who had the worst of it.
And so there is still this pecking order in the children of the Holocaust. You know, oh, your father suffered more than my father. But everybody deals with it in different ways, as the Transcending Trauma Project has discovered. Because people really do learn how to cope with even the most horrific conditions. People can live in concentration camps and come out and thrive, as you've seen with the survivors that you've met. Now, there was one study done by the American Psychiatric Association, and they studied 75 survivors. And then they also studied the children of those survivors. And they found that there seems to have been 4 or 5 types of families that have emerged out of the Holocaust and the children of the Holocaust. There is first the fighter families. And the fighter families are those people who are driven to build and to achieve. They are filled with almost compulsive activities to make it in life and show those damn Nazis and Hitler that they didn't kill us off and we're going to make it. And I think if you remember Bill Lowenberg, who was here, he was like that. He was a fighter family, kinds of a fighter family. He went on to build empires in terms of, his economic wealth, as well as setting up the Holocaust Museum in D.C. and the statues and the Holocaust Memorial in San Francisco. So he comes as an example of the fighter family. Then there are the numb families, and you will hear about this. These are people who have silence around the Holocaust. They're numb, N-U-M-B. Mostly these folks are unable to tolerate what happened, and so they're extremely fragile and sensitive. And so they don't need to be stimulated by remembrances of what happened, so they block it out, and they become numb to the entire experience. And you will hear a story today that is similar to this. Then there are also the families who make it. And these are the folks who actually go for the wealth, the fame, and become more assimilated. And these are the folks who really aspire to higher education and to wealth, fame, and fortune. So I would say, as I described Lowenberg, he's probably of the fighter family, but also of the families who overachieve and make it just to prove. Now, these families, the victim families or the numb families, were often the children of the concentration camp inmates. This was the first literature that came out, and they didn't really look at the other folks, the folks who were on who were sent away in the kinder transports, the folks who were sent away and put into hiding, the folks who got out just in time. So this typology is only now starting to be developed a little bit further. The children of these kinds of families, the fighter families, by the way, were the ones who tended to be part of the resistance. And they sort of carry the same thread. Having been resistors during the war, they come out and they act like fighters even unto today. And so there seems to be some thread of consistency in the families. Now, what the folks at the Transcending Trauma Project have found, and now they've interviewed, they're moving into the 4th generation. The Holocaust survivors, the children of the Holocaust survivors, the grandchildren of the survivors, and now into the great-grandchildren, because some of them of the older generations now have great-grandchildren. And what they're finding is really quite interesting to me. If people were mentally healthy before the Holocaust, they tend to come out mentally healthy after. And if they had emotional problems or family crises or traumas before the Holocaust, guess what? They come out and it's similar later. And so it's a nature of resilience. Some of you are psych majors, and psychology studies resilience. How is it? What keeps people alive and functioning during some of the most difficult times of their lives? Usually a resilient person does so because they have something to hold on to, be it their religion or somebody who helped them through the Holocaust or someone or something to which their faith something that they can look towards and aspire towards to keep them going. And it appears that that's the case as well with those folks who into the fourth generation. Also, those families that tended to be religious, interestingly, you might not be surprised at this, some of them stay extremely religious and really teach the next generations about religiosity. Some of them, having experienced the Holocaust, can't believe that God would have done such a thing, and so they become complete atheists. And then they teach that to their children. So there's no consistency in how religious someone is based on what their experience was during the Holocaust. Another study found that children of survivors had really less resistance to stress and identify less with feelings of being Jewish than with children of escapees. Now that's just one little study, but the essence of it is that children whose parents survived don't identify so much as being Jewish than those who escaped and kept their faith, because they escaped and just kept the faith going. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the literature because I think that we have some interesting stories to tell. But I wanted you to sort of have the typology, so as you hear the stories, you can see and fit the people that you're going to be listening to the typology and the theories. I want to tell you a bit about my story, and as I say, we sort of escalate in intensity of story. My father was born in Lithuania in 1918, and in 1939, everybody knew that war was imminent, and of course many people knew what had been going on in Germany. And money was sent to Lithuania from Massachusetts, from some family members, for one family member of my family of origin, my grandparents and my father's side of the family. One family member could go to the United States. And the visa, in fact, was written for my aunt. And my aunt was a very caring and wonderful woman. Her father, my grandfather, was ill. And she said to my father, "No, you go. You go to the United States, and then you send for us." Well, you all know that many left and couldn't send for their families. My father emigrated across Germany. He left his family, emigrated across Germany, was accompanied by a Gestapo agent who transited him to, he finally got to Britain, took the ship, landed in Boston, where he then, very soon thereafter, met my mother. They married. My father, by the way, had been an Orthodox Jew, brought up in yeshiva, had been very frum, as some of you might know, means really very Orthodox. My maiden name was Schneerson, which in Jewish history is a pretty important name of rabbinical history. And my father threw his tefillin over as he came across to the United States, meaning these are some symbols of orthodoxy. He threw them into the ocean. He came to the United States. He picked them up again and remained an Orthodox Jew for the rest of his life. And he never spoke about his family. Silence, utter silence. When the war broke out, I found out many, many, many years later that very soon after the war broke out and the Nazis began to move across Eastern Europe, they landed in Lithuania, and they didn't round up the Lithuanians the way they did the Poles, the way they did in other and taking people to concentration camps. Instead, what they did was they marched people out to the outer part of the village. They made them dig a pit, and then they shot them at the back of the head. And that was done to my grandmother, my aunt, and to my uncle. Now, when people say to me, "Well, I'm really sorry," yeah, I'm really sorry too. I didn't know these people. It's extremely traumatic to me. What I do know, however, is that my father bore those wounds and that loss for the rest of his life in silence. He found out what had happened to them when I was about age 10. He went to visit some relatives or some folks who had just come from this little village, and he found out in gory detail what happened. I remember the night that it happened. I remember he went upstairs in New York. He came downstairs to the car. We had been waiting for hours. My mother had to drive because he was such a mess, but I never knew what he found out. Never heard the story. My father died. Ultimately, my brother said, "Oh, Dad said a little bit." Finally, a couple of years ago, I really wanted to know the story. And so I got myself a scholarship to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum because I was teaching sociology, wanted to teach genocide and the Holocaust, got myself a scholarship to go to D.C., and I began to do research. And I went on the web, and I went and typed in, there's this little tool at the website for the Holocaust Museum called Shtetl Find, which is finding the little villages in Europe, and I typed in Kupashok, which is the little village, and up comes the whole story. I push another button, and up comes the list of everybody who was killed, including the names of my grandmother, my aunt, and my uncle. I'm sitting in Washington one day, and suddenly the whole story emerges. I'm almost 60 years old. I was 55 years old when I found this out because we were silent about the whole experience. But what did I know about the experience? I knew that I had to fight injustice my entire life. As soon as I was old enough to be aware, I was working on racism. I was working on all kinds of, on the civil rights movement, on the anti-war movement. My father taught me from the time I was an infant that I had to engage in tikkun olam, to heal the tearing of the world. My job in life was to heal the world. So why do I teach domestic violence? Why do I teach genocide? Why am I moved to be a sociologist to tell all of you about this? Why didn't I get it? I didn't get it because there were secrets. We kept a secret in my family until just recently. Now, the final part of the story that I'll tell you is, as a result of finding out about all of this, my brother and I have now become closer. We were not. And this summer, there will be the first trip to this little village, Kupashok, in Lithuania, and there will be a memorial wall put up with all of their names, all of the folks who were killed, and there will be Kaddish read and said, meaning the prayer for the dead will be said at that pit in the village of Kupashok for my family. And every time I think about it, I'm moved, I'm touched, and I know that I will continue to spend the rest of my life being the memorial candle. So that's my story. And now we'll hear from Blair.
Good afternoon. I was asked to speak to you today about what it was like to grow up as the child of a survivor. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but it was probably no different than the rest of you. I grew up in a very normal, loving household. So let me give you a little bit of background about my father and my family. My father, Leo Schweitzer, was born in Lodz, Poland, and he was a survivor. My mother's American. They obviously met after the war, and she's not a survivor. So in about 1940, my grandfather had a foreboding of things to come. So he decided to try to go to Russia to find a place for the family to stay and then to have the family come after. Well, he got caught and spent the rest of the war in a Siberian prison. In the meantime, my father and the rest of his family ended up going into the Lodz ghetto. And my father remembers the day this happened very clearly. It was the first day of his equivalent of our middle school, and he had a new uniform and was very excited, and he came home from school to show his mother his new uniform, and she was sitting outside with the pots and the pans and the down pillows and all their household goods. And it turned out that the Nazis had come in and they wanted to make way for them to have a living space, so basically they kicked my father's family out of their luxury apartment to make room for the SS officers. So after that, my father and his family were sent to the Lodz ghetto, and most of you have heard of the Warsaw ghetto, but the Lodz ghetto was also a very large ghetto at the time. So they were put into a one-bedroom apartment with aunts, uncles, grandparents, the whole extended family were all in this one small apartment trying to somehow survive there. And that is the apartment that his grandparents ended up passing away in, so they never made it past there. In 1943, my father and the rest of his family were, except for his father, were sent in the cattle cars to Auschwitz. And as most of you know, once you get off the cattle cars, the women go to one side, the men go to the other, and they separate the sick from the healthy. So my father and his brother were sent to one side. His mother and aunts were sent to another side. And that was the last time he ever saw his mother, who we went to the gas chamber. And that was the last he ever saw of her. So my father knew that the way to get out of Auschwitz and the way to survive was to basically get out of Auschwitz whatever way he could. So one time when the guards came looking for people to work in a labor camp, my father and his brother volunteered, and they said, yes, we can do that, we can go work. So they went to work in this labor camp, and they were making parts for the planes and the jets that the Nazis were using. Toward the end of the war, the Germans wanted to basically get rid of all the evidence, so they got rid of the labor camp and they sent the slaves on a forced march where basically my father and the other people had to walk about 30 miles a day, basically living on soup and one piece of bread. They were just still wearing the striped pajamas that they had from the camps and little or no shoes, and they had to walk about 30 miles a day. One time during this walk, one of the men who was also walking fell down. And usually what happens is if the guards see someone fall down, they shoot him, and that's the end of it. So my father saw this person fall down, and he risked his own life by helping this man up. And to this day, this man, Irving, still calls my father the person who saved his life. And it's just wonderful when they get together, and we know how important this relationship is. So a few days later, the Russians came and basically liberated all the people who were on the march, and for more or less it was over at the time. So my father survived, as did his brother. And one thing to know is usually they try to separate the siblings, and for some reason my father and his brother were able to stay together, and I think that also helped to have both of them survive, because it really helped in terms of giving each other comfort and the will to live. So my father said that basically he survived on luck, and I know you've had other Holocaust speakers here and they've probably said the same thing, because I know when I ask many survivors, how did you survive? You must be brave, you must be strong and smart. They all said, you know what? I survived because it was luck. It could have been me, but it was a person next to me. It was just luck. So yes, I know there's some luck, but I do think that there was strength, a will to live, a will to survive, and there was just something in these people that let them go on. And he was also smart enough to know to volunteer for jobs and to not stay in Auschwitz, but to get out whichever way he could. So after liberation, my father and his brother spent a few years in Hanover, Germany, and that's where a lot of the survivors went afterwards. There was a Jewish agency who helped some of the people get back on their feet and get started. And so he met a lot of people there who to this day are still his friends. And many of them, when they immigrated to the United States, because some of them were also from Lodz, they joined a society called the Ludzers Young Men's Benevolent Society, which has actually been around since 1902 as a benevolent society, but then after the war, more or less became a survivors organization. So my father's been very involved in that for many years, and for the past couple of years, he's been the president of the organization, which I'm very proud of. So the people who my father met in Hanover and who were in the Ludger Society really became my extended family, because with the exception of my grandfather, my uncle, and one other cousin, that was basically the only family that survived. So these people really became the extended family. We saw them for holidays because we didn't have that many relatives to get together with for holidays, so these people were the people who we got together with. There was always a Ludger event in the Catskill Mountains every year, and we always went to that. And we just have wonderful experiences sharing time with these people who really did become the surrogate family. And they act like siblings sometimes. They argue and disagree like family members do. but they really love each other and they have this experience and this relationship that will transcend anything. So now I'll talk a little bit about being the child of a survivor and how it affected my life. I think what Dean Leader said was correct. The way the Holocaust affects the second generation really has a lot to do with the way it affected, or the way the parents were able to deal with it. My father was very open about things. He didn't walk around, shouting about it, but whenever we asked him questions, he was very open and would talk to us about his experiences. But he did it in such a way that he would answer our questions and give us information, but he didn't try to burden us with it or try to bombard us with it. When my sister and brother and I would ask him questions, he would answer, and we had an idea of what was going on. Obviously, we don't know the full story, and I pretty much don't want to, but we do know, some of the things that happened and what my father went through. So he was always very open about it, but not in a way that made us feel guilty or to feel like, oh my God, this is too much for me to handle. So my father somehow found a way to come to terms with his experiences, and because of that, I think it helped my siblings and I to better come to better understand what he's been through and to be able to go through life without it being too much of a burden on us. So I know some parents, if something went wrong or the children did something they didn't approve, they would say, for this I survived Hitler, and they would make the children feel guilty about things. And my father never did that. He was always very caring and never tried to make us feel that we had to make up for the things that he lost. And I know from other survivors' children, sometimes that is the case. So because he found a way to deal with his past, he made it easier for us to deal with it. So I know that there are supposed to be a lot of these syndromes, and I've read a lot of the second-generation books, and we're supposed to have, some of these things that make us different from other people, and there might be a couple things, but I think because my father did deal with things so well, my sister and brother and I are relatively normal. So I've been trying to think about ways that the Holocaust did affect my life or did affect me while growing up. Education was always very important to my father, and perhaps it's because basically his education stopped that first day of middle school. So he wanted us to continue and have the education that he didn't. So it wasn't just you're going to college. It's what grad school are you going to? It was not even an option about college. Nor was when I took a year off after college before going to grad school, my parents just had a fit. So I think part of it could be because, the education that he lost, he wanted us to have, but it could also be that he's a Jewish parent and that's what they do. So I've also read in some of the Holocaust books about children of survivors having excessive guilt, and that's another thing that I definitely can agree with. I know that personally I do feel guilty when I do things that I know would be hurtful to my father, and I try very hard not to, but one thing I did was to move cross-country. I grew up in New York, and my parents are still there, but about 15 years ago I moved to California, and to this day I still feel guilty about moving away from the family and having the grandchildren away from where my parents are. So guilt is something that, again, is very strong with me, but again, that's another Jewish trait. So throughout my life, I've always had very special feelings for my father, which I think you can tell just from my talking today. So I'm very proud of all the things he's done, how he basically lived through hell, and he didn't come out bitter, he didn't come out angry. He is a wonderful, loving, caring, considerate man, and I think for him to be such a good person after all that he's been through really is a testament to the kind of person he is, and I really do appreciate the fact that, he could have been bitter and angry, and he's not. And he's also the type of person who, whenever you meet him, you just instantly like him. There's something, he's very affable, and everyone who meets him, they just love him. And I think, again, for someone who could have been so different and could have come out so differently through his experiences, the fact that he is such a wonderful, loving man, to me is just, I'm so proud of him. So what I learned about being the child of a survivor, for one thing, I learned about the value of family. One thing the survivors always say is, you never know who your friends are, but you know that your family is always your family. So I try to teach that to my children, and even though they still fight all the time, I'm hoping that they really do appreciate the value of family. And I also try to teach my children about the Holocaust. I don't try to shield them from it. I don't try to have them, turn away and not know. In fact, I kind of bend over backwards to make sure that they do understand about their history. My son and I have watched the Shoah videotape that my father made, and it took a long time for us to watch it because it was hard, it was painful to watch it, but we finally did finish it, and my son really did appreciate being able to watch it, and he said things to me like, it really makes me appreciate what Grandpa went through, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to be able to watch this and understand more about what happened. So my children do have a little bit better understanding about things. My daughter's, she just turned 12. She's still a little bit resistant, but we do talk about it. I try to get her to read some of the books about it, but I think at this point it's still a little hard for her. One thing that's important to me is to give my children a good Jewish education. So even though we're not particularly observant, being a Jew is very important to my father. And again, he's not very observant, but in the Shoah videotape, when he was asked, what's the one thing you would like to tell your children? And he said, to know you're a Jew and be proud of the fact that you're a Jew. So even though his whole family was destroyed because of it and his life was, pretty much destroyed for a while, it's still something that's very important to him. So it's important to me to pass down Jewish education to my family. So 2 years ago at my son's bar mitzvah, one of the traditions is to pass down the Torah from generation to generation. So to have my father, pass the Torah to me and then for me to pass it on to my son, and to know that after, all of that has happened, we're still being able to celebrate Jewish tradition and still pass on these things is very meaningful. So I believe that educating people about the Holocaust is very important, and I try to do what I can. I've urged many of my relatives or friends of the family to do the Shoah videotapes, and as I said, my father did do one, and my aunt and uncle have done one, and I try to encourage all of the ledgers as much as possible to do that. I'm also involved in the Yom Hashoah Committee. That's the Holocaust commemoration that we have here every year, and I've been involved in that for about 10 years now. And I also try to talk with friends and people who I meet about it, because when you talk to someone who's experienced it, then it means so much more than just watching a movie or seeing a video or reading about it. So when people realize that I am the child of a survivor, they'll ask me questions, and I don't brush it off. I really try to talk to them about it so that they know this really happened to real people. I read an article just yesterday that I want to share with you. It was written by Rabbi Yaakov Solomon, the child of a survivor. And the article was about his experiences growing up. And he shares many of the same feelings that I have. And he writes, I suppose that in my own naive way, I was decidedly unaware that there was anything special or distinctive about being a child of Holocaust survivors. Everything seemed so very normal. In fact, it was. Then he went on to say that what his parents wanted for him and for themselves was to blend in, be normal, forget the past, look ahead. And he recounts finding out as an adult that at a Nazi war crimes trial, his father testified to witnessing atrocities that were never mentioned. His father never talked to him about these things. So at the end of the article, Rabbi Solomon writes, Daddy, I have spent many adult years wondering what really happened to you before 1947. I believe it is something that all children of survivors would do well to look into. But looking back now, and knowing that I am now privy to but a speck of the terror you lived through, I say thank you. Your loving shield was a blanket of normalcy for two little boys who love you. Life was good, I recall. You made it that way. So today I echo these same feelings, and I say thank you, Dad. So thank you.
Although every year I keep getting older, I always feel that I should say something about my age. I am younger than most children of Holocaust survivors, and the reason isn't that my parents were children during the Holocaust. They were in their late teens. It's just that I was born late. My mother was 46 when I was born. By the way, my name is Julia Silverberg. I didn't grow up knowing that I was Jewish or that my mother was a Holocaust survivor. It wasn't until her death in 1991 that I discovered the truth. I was 20 years old at the time. My mother made very few demands in her life, but she was adamant about being cremated. She asked us, my father, my brothers, and me, each individually, to promise that upon her death she be cremated. The fact that she had demanded this well before her death stuck in my memory as being strange. But it was at her actual cremation years later that my random suspicions about her hidden identity coalesced into deeper possibility. I didn't want to attend her cremation, but reluctantly, at my father's urging that the family must stick together, I went. The attendants put her gray felt coffin onto a conveyor belt, and suddenly, as I watched the doors of the crematorium oven open and her coffin traveling slowly into its smoldering, ashy depths, I jumped up and ran out of the building. I kept running until I tripped on a sprinkler head and landed on my back. While lying on my back, I realized my family had chased after me and were now standing above me, just as the smoke started spewing from the crematorium chimneys. The moment was surreal. Silently, all of us dressed in black, watching my mother ascend from the chimney stacks. And me, I watched my family. I watched my father shaking his head and mumbling under his breath, while seeing my mother's body transformed into smoke and wafting into the sunshine of the Hollywood Hills. Something about the way he moved, the way he shuddered, instantly tipped me off to the fact that he had probably witnessed this before. I didn't say anything about the epiphany I'd had during my mother's cremation to either my father or my brothers. Instead, once we got home, I went into my mother's bedroom and opened the drawer of her dresser where she kept personal items. I picked up her hairbrush and put it close to my nose, inhaling the remaining scent. As I did this, I noticed a small, aged and yellowing envelope. Within this small envelope, which could easily have been overlooked, were the answers to secrets kept for almost 40 years. There were a total of 6 documents. And actually, I brought some copies of these documents, and I'll put them on the table. So there was a total of 6 documents. They were all very old, delicate, and fraying. The first document I read contained 2 important things. One, the signature at the bottom, which was Edith Silverberg, signed in my mother's handwriting. Until this moment, I had only known a fictitious maiden name. And second, to the right of her signature was the official circular seal of Bergen-Belsen for the Hungarian Committee. Next, there was her original DP card, her displaced persons card, issued by the Allied forces. And the remaining 4 documents were prepared for and used by the United Highest Services, which is the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, as proof of her status as a Holocaust survivor, and they contain the information and the dates of her internment, both in the Budapest ghetto and in Bergen-Belsen. Highest helped many survivors relocate after the war, and as it turned out, they had helped my parents immigrate from Hungary during the revolution in 1956. With the information the documents provided and research I did on my own at the Wiesenthal Center in LA and at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, I was able to put together the framework of my mother's wartime experiences. There are many things I don't know, holes within my research that I'm still hoping to investigate and uncover. Currently, I know she was locked in the Budapest ghetto with her mother, Juliana, in 1944. Her father, Joseph, was sent to a work camp at the Eastern Front. Both of my mother's parents survived. In October of 1944, Eichmann arrived in Budapest to make sure the Jews were properly disposed of and quickly. Although the date changes according to different documents, my mother, along with thousands of young Jewish women, were ordered out of the ghetto in October 1944 and were sent on a death march from Budapest to Vienna. In Vienna, she was herded onto a cattle car. Again, I don't know the exact transport, so I'm unsure of the exact destination. My research shows that most of the Budapesti Jews were sent to Auschwitz first, and later, perhaps days later, as the Russians were coming closer, they transported the newer prisoners to other camps deeper in Germany. I'm unsure if my mother was transported by cattle car or again by marching on foot to the German border and then transported by trains. Either way, she arrived in Bergen-Belsen in mid-October of 1944 and remained there until April 15th, when British troops liberated the camp. Although the story of my discovering these documents and the revelations that occurred from the discovery had a huge impact on my life, in fact changed my life, it's not this single event that had the biggest impact on me as a child of survivors. While the discovery was dramatic, traumatic even, it set me free. It gave me a name and it gave me an identity. I had something to work with. I had answers, where before there was a deafening silence. It is this silence, the shame and the self-hatred that my parents had and that I lived with as a child. This is what has impacted my life the most. It is what I struggle against every day, sometimes every moment. For my mother, the silence and shame for who she was manifested itself through chronic illnesses, including high blood pressure, stroke, seizures, and finally breast cancer. I've read through some of the general survivor personality types, and although my mother did have bouts with depression, she often seemed distant or lost in the past. She also had a recurring nightmare where piles of dead people were angry with her. But she was also wickedly funny, and she was very bright and vivacious. She loved to dance. She was very curious. She was very supportive and very loving and affectionate. Most of all, she was kind, and she had that kind of kindness that drew people to her. For my father, whose identity I'm still uncertain of to this day, his internalized hatred expressed itself through vehement anti-Semitism. He sympathizes with Nazis, admires Hitler, collected Nazi memorabilia, including an authentic SS swastika, swastika medallions, SS armbands, Lugers, and SS daggers. In the wintertime, he wore a heavy Wehrmacht trench coat. He also denies the Holocaust, claiming that there weren't any gas chambers, and denying that 6 million Jews were murdered. In addition, and contradictory to his denouncements of the Holocaust, he believes that Jews deserved what they got during the war for being money-hungry financiers, for controlling the media, and for affecting both art and society with Jewish ideas. My father's anti-Semitism, unlike everything else, was not kept secret. In fact, it was a Sunday morning tradition in our house for him to play German marching music while my brother and I goose-stepped around the living room, raising our arms and yelling Heil Hitler to one another. Another way in which his wartime traumas manifested themselves were by his core mentality, which consisted of a perpetual victim-perpetrator dynamic. Of course, with his recreation, he was the perpetrator and we were the victims. For instance, my father made many impulsive purchases, including buying large amounts of livestock, heavy machinery, and building supplies. Every year, he would buy thousands of dollars worth of lumber or tons of cinder blocks, but rarely did he ever build anything. More often, the piles would begin to rot and decay. But if he felt my brother and I were too idle, he would have us move these piles of lumber and blocks from one location to another, for no reason other than to implement power. At first, when I was little, I enjoyed the menial labor and proving to my father how strong I was. But later, I realized that he did it just to break our will. Also, every year, he forced us to plant acres and acres of potatoes by hand, and then harvest them and bag them, only to let them rot in the basement. It wasn't so much the hard work or even the monotony. The worst was the meaninglessness. And of course, the fact that my friends were taking dance classes, learning to play musical instruments, and playing sports, while I felt I was basically enslaved. Like many survivors, my parents were mistrustful of others, mistrustful of humanity in general, mistrustful of institutions. They feared some catastrophe was about to happen at any minute, which we prepared for by building a bomb shelter and keeping large supplies of livestock and food, especially potatoes. There were no consistent rules while I was growing up. I didn't have to go to bed before midnight. I didn't have to do homework. I didn't even have to go to school. But suddenly, out of nowhere, according to my father's particular mood for that particular moment, I could do something wrong and enrage him. Mainly, he was enraged around mealtimes. Mealtimes were incredibly stressful in our house. It seemed like our very safety and survival hung on the bare thread of my mother's ability to serve 3 meals a day exactly on time and with exactly the right amount of salt. If she didn't, he slammed the food onto the ground, smashed things, and stormed around the house as if her mistake was a personal affront. As a child, I had a lot of fears, phobias, and I developed a strange feeling of dissonance, like my mind was separate from my body, like I was observing my life rather than feeling it. After my mother died, I developed severe anorexia, which kept me distant and distracted from myself for most of my 20s. At 26, I started to see a therapist. Therapy was very difficult because it was hard for me to get honest with my therapist because I felt I was betraying my parents, betraying their secrets. But I did it anyway. And I felt I had to do this grief work because my parents could not do it. And I discovered that, like my mother, who had dreams of dead people that were angry with her, that I also had a form of survivor's guilt. I wanted to be a Holocaust survivor. I wanted to know her secrets intimately. I wanted something traumatic enough to have occurred in my past to match the terror and panic that I felt constantly. What I didn't realize then was that I had experienced enough trauma, and that trauma was transferred through my parents, and obviously that was the cause of my terror. It is by speaking, and especially for me by writing, about my family that I'm able to transcend much of the misery associated with their past and my past too. It was only a few years ago that I couldn't face anything to do with the Holocaust. I couldn't look at photos, watch documentaries, or see movies. Whenever I attempted to do research or delve into it, I talked myself out of it. Why focus on sad things? Move on. I attempted to rationalize my way into denial. Others, friends, even survivors told me to forget about it. Be happy. You're an American. Occasionally, someone would even tell me that they didn't see why I was so upset by the Holocaust. After all, it didn't happen to me. I often tell people I didn't choose to be interested in the Holocaust. It chose me. I can't turn away from it, and I've accepted that. And ultimately, for me, it was by accepting that I'm compelled to write and to speak about the Holocaust. And that's what freed me. It was by breaking the silence my family kept for decades, and by bracing who I am completely, including the Holocaust. This acceptance has helped heal me. Honestly, at first I didn't talk or write about these experiences out of any altruistic duty, but more as an opportunity to look inward. Today, I'm still unsure why, what my motive is. I just know that I must speak of these things, the Holocaust, things my parents felt were unspeakable. In a way, I'm a reactionary. Where they didn't want to be Jews, I embrace my Jewishness. Where they felt they must remain silent, I feel that I must have a voice. Thank you.
With people who would like to talk, please.
I have kind of two questions for you. Did you ever really know why your mom wanted to be cremated? And also, do you think maybe your mom, it might be obvious, maybe your mom didn't talk about it because it was hard?
She asked me if I ever really found out if she really wanted to be cremated. Why? No, I guess my answer is no. It's more of a guess. I've kind of put together her psychology on my own through reading. But I don't really know. Her mother also, who is a survivor, wanted to be cremated. There was a lot of reasons. You know, she was really, in the Jewish faith, to be cremated is it's not acceptable. And it was another way for her to split with Judaism, I think. And your second question?
Why, if maybe your mother was the way she was, not talking about it because of your father.
Yeah, thinking about my parents and what they had some kind of understanding between them, I don't think I'll ever quite understand that. But I think that my mother was the type of survivor that kept perpetuating her suffering, her victimization. And I think my father is Jewish, and it's also his cover-up, is to be so anti-Semitic. And then my mother knows his background, and she knows why he's doing it. That doesn't obviously make it right. But, yeah.
Over here.
Have you published anything since you said that you're writing?
I haven't.
Or is that a plan, do you think?
It is. I am writing, and I'm the first time this last week I actually sent one of my short stories out. But I went back to school when I was 29. I'm 33 now, so I have all these classes that kind of get in the way.
That's all you want to know? Come on, where's inquiring minds?
Is your father still alive?
My father is still alive.
And what does he think about what you're doing?
Well, I hadn't spoken to him for about 4 or 5 years. And then the Jewish Bulletin, which is a newspaper in the Bay Area, did a story about me, and it turned out like I was on the cover, like this huge picture of me. And somehow my father got a hold of that. He found out about it. And so I knew that he was, the fact that I broke the silence, that he was probably really enraged and freaking out. So I went to his house to speak to him, and it was a difficult thing to do, but it really helped. It helped him and it helped me, because he had all these ideas that I was going to out the family and destroy, or someone was going to hurt us, and I was starting to have feelings about him like that too. Like, is he going to get me back for speaking? But what I did, and I never realized that I was important enough to my father that he would do this, but I set boundaries of what he can do and what he cannot do around me, and he does it. So I don't see him often, and I don't want to, but yeah, and we have somewhat of a relationship, which I know after hearing that story sounds strange. But.
Could you speak to your relationship with your brothers, too?
Sure. I have 2 brothers. One is 15 years older than me, and the other one is 2 years older. My oldest brother, after my mother's death, he had a nervous breakdown, and he really hasn't worked since, he lives with my father, and they're still doing same stuff as when I was growing up, the same victim-perpetrator dynamic. He's just kind of slid into my mother's position. And my other brother, Eric, you know how when you're 19 or 20, people take off backpacking through Europe? He left and he just really never came back. I do hear from him, but he doesn't, he's not really in the country that often.
Are either of them Jewish?
You know, every time I see them, which again isn't often, they always have to bring that fact up about how they feel about being Jewish. And no, neither of them really feel it, and they don't want to associate. They just see the Holocaust, and they see my mother's experience as something really dark and sad and depressing, and they don't want to go there. And they don't want, to them, being a Jew means being a victim.
Where was your father during the Holocaust?
Okay, let's see. I have a little bit of stories. I know he was in a prison where he got tuberculosis and almost died. I don't know what prison. I don't know if it was, a lot of Hungarians were in work camps at the Russian front, at the Eastern Front. So I'm not sure if he was just in a work camp. He was young. He was 16 or 17. But I don't know anything further than that.
Here.
I want to thank you for what you shared. I wanted to ask each one of you if any of you have experienced any kind of backlash with anything like the neo-Nazis or anything in that way. And Demeter, you said that you're going to go back to your family's town. Have the other two have done anything like that?
I haven't. At one point, my father was going to go with his brother back to Poland, and they just kept putting it off and putting it off. I guess, they were, part of them wanted to and part of them were, scared to do it. And then my uncle passed away, and I know my father's not going to do it on his own. And frankly, I have no interest in going there. From what I hear about, even afterwards, the way the people treated the Jews who returned, I just have no desire to go there.
Actually, I'm not going to go this summer, and I made the decision not to go for a number of reasons. One of them financial. It was going to be a huge amount of money, and I wanted to take my daughter. But secondly, my father used to say, whenever I would say to him, Dad, do you want to go back? He'd go, why would I want to go there? So I don't feel like I have to. I have contributed to the wall that will be built. I do intend at some point, if I'm in Eastern Europe, that I will go through there. But, it was going to be in an air-conditioned bus with 45 people, and that's not my kind of travel. So I'll rather go on my own someday with my kid. How about you, Blair? Are you going to go? I mean, Julia, sorry.
I've been to Budapest quite a few times, and the first time I went to find, on these documents, they have the last address that my mother and my grandmother were in the Budapest ghetto, and the ghetto was right behind one of the most famous synagogues in Europe, called the Dohani Synagogue, and her apartment was right behind it, and my brother and I went back there, and it's still kind of a poor neighborhood, and we knocked on the door, and a very suspicious woman opened the door, and our Hungarian is heavily American accented, and she's very suspicious of us, and we tried to say our mother lived here during the war, and she slammed the door in our face.
And actually, I want to follow up on that. We've made contact in this village in Lithuania, and there's a lot of fear there that you're going to come back and ask for reparations.
Or for your stuff.
Or for your stuff. I mean, my father's family owned a home and a shop. They were confiscated. They're gone. And no reparation work has been done in any of those Eastern European countries. They've only been dealing with Germany and a little bit with Poland. So that's, and my brother and I have thought, should we do it? And it's like, we've got our own lives here, and that would be pure bitterness. So I feel more like I want to be the memorial candle here and work on stopping genocides globally rather than looking backward at it.
A question for all three of you. Have you documented your research, and if so, have you found an appropriate repository for the research or for the documentation?
Well, I'm not an academic, so I haven't done that. Although the original documents that I found, I'm trying to get my oldest brother, we haven't really been speaking for years, and he's always been angry at me for talking about this, and he has the documents. So every year I try to get them from him because I'd like to put them in the archives at Yad Vashem.
I'll answer that. I've been doing a lot of research. I don't have any original documents, however, because my father got here in '39. But I've developed a personal relationship with the Holocaust Museum, so I do a lot of work with them and intend to continue it. And actually, I wanted to follow up on your question, one more piece that I didn't answer. Recently, I've been doing more research on this village, and my brother found something on the internet about the United States government was prosecuting a man who had come into the United States illegally, and did anyone have any information on this village? And so I called the special prosecutor in the U.S. government, and I heard the whole story about what had happened, and it turns out that the Nazis didn't perpetrate this. It was the villagers who did it, which is not uncommon for a lot of Eastern European villages. That there was one Nazi collaborator, and so when the Nazis came in, they encouraged the locals to commit these atrocities. And so Eastern Europe, Latvia, and Estonia, Lithuania, most of the Holocaust events were done by local people with heavy anti-Semitism. And they just used it as an opportunity to do what they would have liked to have done anyway. And there's a hell of a lot more research to be done about what's gone on in Eastern Europe that hasn't yet even been covered. How about others? Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any children, if you share this information with them, or if they have any interest in pursuing or what their aspect is.
Well, I've been talking to my children, as I mentioned, and in fact, my son is going to have to do a project for his humanities class about someone who emigrated to the United States, so he's going to interview my father, and so they do talk about it a little bit. Because my parents live cross-country, we don't get to have them together too much, but they are definitely starting the dialogue more. And as I said, my daughter is still, she still wants to be shielded from it a little bit, but we have the video of my father, and my son's watched the whole thing, and next year I'm going to have my daughter watch it. We'll watch it together.
And in terms of my child, I have to say I was brought up Orthodox and it was a heavy, dark home, survivor home. And so when I ran away far and long and became an atheist for most of my life. I've only recently come back to it. So my daughter was raised as an atheist, and so she's been raised to understand that she's Jewish, but she doesn't know anything about Judaism, which I now really regret, because but it, it was just something that happened because of the trauma of my father's experience, actually, I would say. I ended up like that. But recently, she asked me just the other day, so Mom, is there anything positive to tell me about the family? Because all I've heard about is, the illness on one side and the Holocaust on the other. And, and I've now started to tell her stories of life in Lithuania before the Holocaust and some of the joy and some of the heritage that our family has. But she's 32, and she's only now starting to ask those kinds of questions. I think it takes a long time, especially if you were running the way I was running, to get away. Because we kept the curtains down in my house for my entire childhood, and we were always told, watch out, the neighbors. Watch out for the neighbors. Because the neighbors killed our families. And I also failed to mention that although my father is directly a survivor, a refugee, on my mother's side, her cousins and all of her aunts were killed in Russia. My grandmother got out in the 20s, so she was here, but the rest of the family had stayed in Russia, so all of them were killed as well. And there's only one survivor of that family. He lives in Southern California now. And so my daughter has met him, and so she's starting now to hear about the stories about life in Russia, not Lithuania. So we're only now, very late, because it was such a secret for so long, finally starting to put it all together. Thank you for asking, because this is like a works in progress for all of us. You know, we haven't finished the journey. Okay.
I have two questions. When were they killed in Russia? Is the first one.
Actually, I think it was 1944. 43? 43.
Who killed them?
Oh, well, it was the army moved on through, well, he had been,
German army.
right, it was the German
Oh,
army.
I see.
Right.
And the next question was about the Gestapo officer. that
Yeah, accompanied my father,
Yeah.
because he was a Jew, and there had been some, this is just folklore, right? Folklore. My father told my brother told me. So who was this and why? I still don't understand. But he was accompanied across Germany. So go figure out. I still don't understand it. But I know the story is that my father was watching as they were going, that he saw the buildup of the military and knew what was imminent and what was coming.
Before the war.
It was just before the war. Right. It was 39 before war broke out. Right. Somebody else.
He was a Polish citizen, therefore.
He was a Lithuanian
He could-
citizen.
he could-
He had good safe passage. That's probably the answer. He had safe passage as a Lithuanian citizen. And they were not yet at war with Lithuania.
Yeah, but one person, one bureaucrat.
Yeah,
Which part of it, and
that's pretty strange.
yeah.
Go figure.
I'm a child of a survivor. My mother was in hiding in France in a town called Bergerac. There's a 10, 11-year-old during the war. And she didn't speak, she came here as a refugee in like 1948, got married in 50. And she hardly ever spoke of her experiences. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s when I was in therapy talking about this waking dream I would have in a childhood. I was probably 6, 7 years old, and I had a place to hide. I had planned that if people came to the house in uniform to take me away, I would hide in the hamper. And I knew I had, they play hide and seek, and I knew that I could fit in this hamper and close the lid. And I never connected that with my mother's experience until I was like in my 30s, talking about this in therapy, and realized that this was my intergenerational
Transmission.
trauma experience.
Right.
Like I was reacting as if I had been hiding, even though my mother hardly talked about this experience. I also want to mention the incredible ambivalence I have about a sense of responsibility to do things to fight injustice, and at the same time a fear of being too visible in the process of fighting injustice, because I don't want to be too visible in which it exposes me to danger. So, interesting profession that I've chosen, I'm a psychologist, and so I do my quote-unquote justice work behind a closed door.
Good
When
answer.
it comes to going out and marching or speaking in public, it's very hard for me to cross that line. And recently my wife here, Karuna, converted to Judaism, and she wears a yarmulke on her head all the time, and it makes me nervous.
Right.
So that's just some of the things that you've helped me think about.
Right. I want to comment on your waking dream, because I have, and it's not uncommon, I've heard this from many children of survivors and refugees. I too have a waking dream, and it's before I fall asleep, but it's always awake, and I'm falling into a pit, into infinity and death. Right? Well, how did my family die? In a pit. And I remember saying it to my father when I was a kid, falling into a pit. No, Elaine, not a kite. Craziness. Well, he knew how they died, but it's sort of, we have the collective unconscious, and we carry it, and so it's the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And are we healthy? Yes. Everybody carries their burden. Some of you have alcoholic parents, and some of you were beaten, and some of you have neuroses, and ours is this, and I don't know that it's any worse or any better. I hate to say it because it's a wrong metaphor, but it's the cross we bear,
Well, I have a trivial example that you reminded me with the hamper story. I had LASIK surgery, the eye surgery a few years ago, and I think the reason I did it was because I always had this fear deep down that if someone came in the middle of the night and we quickly had to leave, that I wouldn't have to, search for my glasses and take them, or be in prison somewhere without my glasses. So even though my father was open about this, and I didn't have all the childhood traumas that some people did, even as an adult, I still think about certain things and do certain things because of what might.
I definitely have some of that too. I was just thinking as Blair was speaking about this thing I have about shoes. Like every time I put shoes on, well, this wouldn't be very good to have on if suddenly I was on a death march. And I guess I started to voice these things to my current boyfriend, to the point where he's now, he'll put on shoes and go, oh. Not sure if these are a good idea.
Yes, please.
I'm also a child of the Holocaust, but I'm the child of displaced people who lost their family, a lot of their family, in the concentration camps. And I don't know if this is a dream or a true story that my mother told me. I'm not sure. That I see people being killed in a courtyard from our Berlin apartment. And I don't know if this is something I saw, something she told me, or something I dreamt. I can't tell whether it's reality, imagination, or memory. I really don't know. I was born in 1933, the year Hitler came to power. German and Spanish are my mother tongues. I grew up in Uruguay and in Puerto Rico because I was the child of a very intelligent man who long before he even read, the minute he read Mein Kampf, he said, let's get out of Germany. I'm a fourth generation Berliner. I was invited back by the mayor of Berlin, and my husband and I, our trips were paid, and a week at a five-star hotel in Berlin, and a tour all around the city, and showing us some of the things they are doing about the Holocaust. Although I do remember that I spoke to children on buses in Germany, and nobody knew anything about what happened. Nobody knew anything had happened in Germany. And these were school children.
When was
how much
that?
education really was taking place in Germany after the war, and this was 3 years ago. I really don't know. My mother grew up in southern Germany in the Black Forest, and she was a dressmaker, and she became a dress designer in Berlin. With the help of my father, she became very well known. She dressed Leni Riefenstahl, the woman who made Triumph of the Will, and she dressed the nobility, the people in show business, the wife of the mayor in Germany. She had a picture gallery that's incredible. I did tapes of my parents continuing to do a bibliography of my parents, which is biography, which is still in the works.
Great.
She had a shop right off the Kudamm on Ulanstrasse in the middle of Berlin. And my father said, before Hitler came to power, he said, let's have our child born in England, France, or Switzerland. And my mother, who reached this height in her career, didn't want to leave. And she said, but I don't speak the language. And my father spoke 9 languages, so it wasn't a problem for him. In fact, there were a lot of famous Berliners in the family. One was the president of, I'm straying. But anyhow, we finally went to Uruguay because my mother had a client whose husband was Uruguayan consul in Breslau, and she was German, and my mother dressed her, and we got a visa for Uruguay. And my uncle came a few years later in 1939, and he arrived in Uruguay with a visa to Paraguay, and he stayed in Uruguay until the day he died. My father used to kid him all the time. He said, you never saw your real fatherland. But that's how it was in South America. But we fortunately came to the United States eventually, and I'm very grateful that I had a father who was so intelligent that he pushed and pushed and pushed. Now, the rest of the family wasn't convinced. My aunt and her husband went to Theresienstadt, which today in Professor Toller's class I learned was the camp where the elite went.
No, it was the show camp. It was the show camp.
For publicity purposes. And from there they went to Auschwitz. Now, my parents had a lot of guilt, an incredible amount of guilt. Even though they tried to talk the family into leaving and the family wouldn't leave. And they always said, oh, but this can't be happening and this is just a passing phase and this will all go away and so on. But they still felt very guilty that they were killed in the gas chambers. And to this day, I believe that my parents became vegetarians and deprived themselves of a lot of things that they were able to have in their lives because they had feelings of guilt. My father died, he looked like he was in a concentration camp. And I think that, the guilt, he deprived himself of a lot of things. He didn't believe in doctors. And he was an intelligent, educated man.
Okay.
But I'm going on too much.
All right. Well, thank you. Are there other questions? Other things you want to hear about children? Yes.
One of the students, I know that over from Blair said that your parents didn't really talk about it. I was wondering if you had any advice, like how to get someone to talk about it. I know, maybe it's too late for you now, but if someone doesn't want to talk about it, like you said, like the numb families, like how is there any way?
Actually, I do have some advice about it because there's a lot of projects going on now to get the testimony of people who survived and who are soon to die. And what's happening is that there seems to be this moment that a lot of folks who didn't ever want to talk about it are now willing and able to because they realize that they have something to tell. So there's the Shoah Project down in LA and the Holocaust Memorial Museum are really seeking testimonies, and there are other projects as well, seeking testimonies, so that when people know of a survivor, they're now being encouraged to participate in this. And it seems that I just read something from the museum in D.C. where there was recently a reunion that they had, and they brought people who had never come to a survivor reunion who are now willing to start coming and bring their grandchildren because they want them to now hear the story. So it appears that the silence is finally being broken because, it's a generation. It's generations later. So it's happening. So when one knows of a survivor, one needs to be encouraged to get in touch with one of these projects because they want their testimony.
Even it's my grandma, and we're not Jewish, but she was displaced, lived in England, and she was one of the children who got sent out to the country, and so she has a lot of stories about that, but she doesn't really talk about it. So I know how to,
Oh, I
I
see.
don't know if we get in touch with the people, but
You have a piece of advice?
Go ahead, because I had a summary thing.
Okay, well then, yes, I would recommend this. What I did before my father died and before my uncle died was I got a video camera and I came into the house and I said, I don't care if you don't want to tell me the story, I'm just going to ask you some questions. And we started out real simply, tell me about life in Lithuania before, and I heard about Charlie the horse and, and all the rest of it. And then you have to build the rapport, there's a whole method to oral history that I'd be happy to share with you, actually. And then ultimately, after a couple of days or hours of trust, then you start to get into the hard stuff about the hiding. But there's a process. Oral history is very subtle, but you can get to it.
I actually started with my father with cassette tape because he didn't want to be on video, so he felt more comfortable, just talking, knowing that he wouldn't be on camera, so that made it easier for him. And we also did it with his brother there, so it was also easier for him because they could share the experience. So I don't know if that would be possible for you. But if it comes from the child or the grandchild saying, this is my history and my heritage, and do it for me. And that's what I've been doing with a lot of the survivors, is saying, do it for your children, do it for your grandchildren. It's something that they'll always cherish. So give them guilt.
It's interesting that you brought that up because as I was sitting here listening to our guest today, I was thinking that perhaps some of you have relatives who could tell you stories about their lives that would enrich your own understanding of where you've been and where they've been. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't have a relative who cannot give them a story. A grandparent, a great-grandparent, someone who lived through the Depression, someone who perhaps did something that was unusual for the time, and that you all should make an effort to talk to the people, your elders, about their lives. And it's interesting that you brought that up. Anybody who's interested in oral history, one of the things we have in the Holocaust Center is a guide that was prepared by the Holocaust Memorial Museum on how to conduct oral interviews. And as sociologists, many of you, this is, this is a technique that you can also use, and that is one of the research methods that sociologists use. So if you think about it, we all have people in our families who we could interview and who we can learn a great deal about who we are ourselves.
There's a question there.
Yes, I want to follow up with what you just said, and that it reminds me that another lesson in this is the power of secrets. To take this beyond the Holocaust, to generalize to all of our experience, that secrets in previous generations have effects on the next generation and the generation after that. It doesn't have to be about the Holocaust, it can be about other things. And that it has an effect on
Another thing, if you haven't yet read the short story that was put on eReserve, Hayuda's Engagement Party, which is the cost of silence that goes across 3 generations, now would be a good time to read it because it will reverberate with a lot of what we've heard today.
In connection with the idea of secrets, you also must be very careful about what you do, because people who keep secrets very often have deep, sincere reasons to do it, and that your desire for knowledge is not as important as their ultimate health. And so if they want to talk to you, that's one thing. Going into probe is more in line with what professionals do. But anybody, I'm sure Dean Leader has offered, and certainly we have resources for you if you're interested in doing an oral history of your family. One last question.
My father was a survivor as well, he's on the second generation survivor, but he was very open with what he told us, and a lot of times maybe too open with the things that we know now. But I think of how frustrating it would be. You're saying some people have reasons for keeping their secrets, but if you're a child of that person, you want to know, because it's not that you're reliving it in a way you are, but how frustrating it must be to not have the answers that you need to. I remember asking my dad so many, and I had an uncle and another uncle, all three of those brothers survived together, and we did videotape them, and we did get them on tape, and we did get their stories, but I had so many more questions that never got answered, and I think of someone that knows they survived but doesn't know anything. That's so cruel. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make it worse, but to not know.
It is frustrating, but at least she left me that. At least she left me that, because before then, I think as children, you're very intuitive. And I mean, obviously my father's behavior was pretty obvious. Something horrible happened. I know that they were in Hungary during the war, and then horrible things happened, but I didn't have an answer to what exactly it was. Although, in Hungarian, they talked about it right in front of me, but I didn't know the word for concentration camp in Hungarian. It wasn't until later, kind of after my mother died, and I found those papers, that all my memories, all the hints came together, and then it was obvious. But yeah, it is frustrating.
I don't know what's worse though, being bombarded with it all your life and getting all the trauma transferred to you.
I got it anyway.
Or having
She got it anyway, though. She got it.
The best of both worlds.
The best of both worlds.
The best.